lugar, por favor.
Kindly have a seat, please.
So those are the in-house announcements that we had for this morning, and now we will proceed to the first presentation of this morning's session.
I think it's on. It's on. Again, good morning. It is my pleasure to open the first session, but at the same time, we thought it was a good idea also to, before we actually start the presentation of the first session, is that we provide an overview of the agenda of the 2.5 days. So Ronald will provide us that insight. Ronald, with that, could you take us through the agenda?
Good morning. I was very glad to see everybody being able to make it all the way out to Aguascalientes. Well aware of travel difficulties for some of you. I would like to go a little bit to give you the overview of what we are actually doing this week. We'll start out with 2.5 days of the conference, ending on Wednesday around 1 o'clock. Then on Wednesday afternoon there is the OECD expert group on the extended supply and use tables, which will last until 6, a little later than normally, because we will end most of our days at 5 o'clock, except Wednesday, that will be going on until 6. And then on Thursday we will have the Strengths of the Chair group meeting, which is, we have the whole day for it. We'll see how it goes. I will provide some information for the members and for those interested to participate regarding the agenda and some of the background documents. I will make that available to you during today or tomorrow. As far as the agenda for the first 2.5 days, I'm happy to say that that everybody is here except Stefano Menginello, who could not make it because of health reasons. So his presentation tomorrow morning will not be made. Peter Bug-Nielsen, who was on the agenda, has been in touch with me a number of times. He will not be here himself, but he sent everything, and I will act as Peter on the second day. Other than that, the setup of the meetings is there will be, in general, presentations with the short question and answer sessions after that. And then after each block of presentations panel, we will have, we hope to have sufficient time for general discussion. So this morning we'll have a general discussion, which will be from about the last hour until 1 o'clock. So let me also, one thing I didn't say is that we will have sessions where will be a coffee break in the morning around 11, and then we will go on until 1 o'clock, the morning sessions. We'll start at 9 o'clock again tomorrow morning. And the afternoon session is from 2:30 till 5. So the afternoon session is a little shorter, and we will still want to see that we have enough time for presentations. I think that's all I had to say. Thank you.
With that, I would like to turn to the presentations of this first session. The session, as indicated, will run from 10 till 1, with a break at 11. Till the break, we have 2 presentations from Professor Tucker and one from Mr. Karoshi. Very good. My apologies. And in the afternoon, we will have Nadim Ahmed and Steve Landeveld, which will lead us to 12:30 and will allow us a discussion of about half an hour. I would like to suggest also that there is after each of the presentations, there is absolutely room for about 10 minutes see clarifications and drawing things maybe together when we progressively move forward. So in that sense, there's plenty of time, and we will have plenty of time for interactions, because that's the idea, is that we bring all these elements together progressively when we discuss these various items. This session, as you have seen, will take a more sort of macroeconomic perspective, a system perspective, and we look at the various sort of aspects from the dimensions of the environment, society, and the economy. So I'm very happy that we have an excellent set of speakers. With that, I will turn to introducing Arnold Tucker. For those who are not immediately familiar to Arnold, although he has been a great friend to us at the global level at various sort of stages, and I will indicate also why he is a great friend in my introductions to Arnold. Since October last year, Arnold became Professor of Industrial Ecology and Director of the Institute of Environmental Science at the Leiden University. In addition, he is also professor at the Sustainable Innovation University at Trondheim in Norway. He is, apart from being having excellent academic credentials, he is also very much known to our world because he has coordinated a string of major programs at the European level, and coordinating a large research program on resource efficiency, and as he himself indicated, the most ambitious program on developing a database on global energy, resource and economic input-output databases and models. In short, this is called ActioBase. He has been engaged with us in various sort of UN initiatives on the green economy, for instance. He is also part of the resource panel of the OECD. And then he has also contributed to the programs on sustainable consumption and production, and increasingly also engaged in the Sustainable Development Goals initiative. With that, I would like to invite Arnold to take up your presentation, and we're looking forward to that broader perspective of bringing the different dimensions together in a broader sort of ecological, economic and social footprint rather than global value chains. With that, Arnold, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks Ivo. And can someone put the presentation up? Because otherwise, oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, Ivo, thanks for introducing me so nicely. But frankly, when I was looking at the program and I saw the list of speakers, and that was ending with probably one of the best known people in economic and environmental statistics globally, Steve Landeveld, I was like, why am I first? I was kind of like, you know, normally the big persons or the rock stars, if you like, you know, they come up first in these kind of conferences. But the minute when I thought about rock stars, I was like, oh, that's it. If you go to a rock concert, it usually works as follows. First, you have the most unknown support act available. Then you have a kind of a national hero, and then the real big persons come up. So that is maybe a little bit my position. But okay, I think indeed, Ivo, you introduced me quite well. I'm around here mainly actually because I did a lot of work on environmental statistics. And I was struck actually by a little talk that we had when walking here to the INEGI building, when I forgot the name of the person, but he was talking about how to assess global value chains and how to link that with microdata level from an economic perspective. What I'm doing in my field, we do what is called life cycle assessment. We are interested in understanding the environmental impacts of, let's say, making this mobile phone. But then we have to look like Nokia. Who are you, you know, sourcing your plastics from? Who are you sourcing your steel from? Who are you sourcing your transistors and all this kind from? And how does it work? That is all environmental statistics that we use, but it is also, I would say, company level and product level statistics. And then we try to link that again to, let's say, macroeconomic statistics like the International Energy Database and all this kind of stuff. And I'm pretty sure when we dive deep into the methodologies that we use at the environmental side and that mostly of you use at the economic side, I'm pretty sure that you see a lot of kind of things that go and see it. It works, that's good. Okay, I first will have actually far too many slides for the 25 minutes I have, but I will try to bring you quickly through it. I will first review some key environmental policies, then make the case that multi-regional environmental economic input-output databases are essential for actually supporting these kind of initiatives. And then I will end with some ideas how actually the work done by scientists, the work done by the OECD, Nadine, the work done by the United Nations statistical divisions, you know, the people from the WIOT database that I know very well at Groningen University from my country, how you can bring that together and how you really can say, well, how can we really make one big package of that that really is consistent and that all the communities can use for their own purpose. But first, sustainability policies. There are a lot of them. Ivo, you already summarized them. You have sustainable consumption and production. You know, that is done by UNEP, was very prominent in the Rio discussion. And that is all about, if you don't read let's say, the definition in detail, but it is about a better quality of life while minimizing the use of natural resources. Then you had something that is now, I'm not sure if it's still alive at UN level, but certainly the Green Growth Initiative at the OECD is very alive and kicking. So the Green Economy Initiative has as goal improved human well-being while reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. And then you have something that may be quite European, but also Asian, I believe. If you look at China or Japan and a number of other Asian countries, they really bet on resource efficiency. And again, that is deliver greater value with less input. And it all comes down to this picture. You want to have the yellow line going up, that human well-being for all the people in the world is going up. Hopefully, you don't need that much GDP for that. So you want to have more human well-being while having less GDP. That is actually the beyond GDP agenda that I will not touch upon. Then you want to have this more economic activity with less resource use, and particularly with a reduction of environmental impacts, particularly with regard to climate. Well, if you then look at things like, okay, I can organize all kind of data, I can gather all kind of data, I can try to do all kind of things. I have another picture I will not show you, but there are too many indicator systems and too many data sets, they are all competing and they confuse actually the world. I think what the system of economic and environmental and economic accounts 2012 just released, set up again in the guidance of the UNCEA and the London Group has done, is I think a magnificent piece of work. What they basically say is make a very simple distinction between the natural system, that is actually the whole earth that they depict there, and the socio-economic system. That is where we have the extraction of minerals, the manufacturing of products, the use of products, and the waste management. And of course we do that all for a reason. We want to have income, job satisfaction, and well-being. Then they say, look at natural, economic, and social capital stocks. So economic capital stocks you're all familiar with, but if you go, let's say, to natural capital accounting, you look to the value of the environment. And I know that the World Bank has done very nice analysis of assessing natural capital and social capital. And actually what you see is that the natural capital and the social capital in the world, so the fabric in societies, the substance that people in Africa have from just nature, is actually 3, 4, 5 times, I forgot the number, as the global GDP. So actually economic capital and economic GDP is one thing, but if we destroy natural capital and social capital, you actually end up poorer as we want to be. And then a thing where I will focus on is that one way of really expressing economic relations at a national and global level is, I think, the supply and use table and the input-output table is one of the best means of doing that. And by that, you really make an assessment of the economic system. You come to grips with that. But then on top of that, all these industry sectors that are working there, and also, of course, households that have activities in the economic system, at the end of the day, they extract resources and they create emissions. And that is in the system of economic and environmental accounts and the supply and use and input-output system. Quite easily, you can easily catch that by adding them as extensions. And then all of a sudden you have this nice matrix of supply and use tables with all your environmental data as far as flows concerned already organized. And I will show later that this is a very powerful way of doing all kind of analysis. If you have your data organized in this way, you can basically do anything you want. I will come to that now, the usefulness of multi-regional input-output tables. Yeah, there we go. Oh, what is going on here? Well, of course, we have now a number of countries that already, in Europe, and I see Isabella sitting there who did a lot of work on that. We have now, for instance, for the EU, supply and use tables at an aggregated level. We have colleagues of Isabel work on that very hard as well. We have extensions for that, like a number of air emissions, carbon emissions, but we are also working in Europe on, let's say, resource extractions. One of the problems with that is that particularly in Europe, my area where I live, what we have done in the last 20 years, we have outsourced a lot of our industry work to China, to the developing world and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of things that we used to produce on our territory, that generated emissions on our territory, or the mining that we did on our territory, we actually now rely on other countries. And we try to, the UK is a very nice example of that. We try to actually make our money with things like services, banking and all this kind of stuff. And of course that worked very well until the economic crisis. But okay, I don't want to make jokes about if this economic policy was right or not. I want to talk about what it means for environmental monitoring. What I show here is an assessment of carbon emissions per capita. And you see basically, if you do that from a production perspective, it looks like as if Europe has something like, 9.1 ton per capita in carbon emissions. And if you do it from a consumption perspective, where you look like, okay, what is coming into Europe and all this kind of stuff, it looks like the same. And that is very weird because there are a lot of other studies that make very clear that actually the pollution embodied in the imports in Europe is much higher than the pollution embodied in the exports. So actually other countries, and I will show later how bad that is, pollute for actually the well-being of Europe, if I put it very bluntly. And that is because we have only statistics at European level at that point. We do not know the pollution embodied in imports. You make, let's say, assumptions like the domestic technology assumption, that you say, well, the imports are probably made with technologies that we also use in Europe and will be as polluting as in Europe, but that is not how it works. And assessments done by people using similar techniques as I do have shown, and that have time series, they show quite clearly, and I think this is a picture for the UK, where if you look from a consumption perspective, so what we consume in the UK, and you look at all the life cycle emissions over the total value chain of CO2, that goes, oh sorry, this goes wrong. That goes up. That is pretty clear. Where the UK, they meet their Kyoto Protocol targets. Their territorial emissions go down. And if you look deeper into the assessment of that, that is in part due to real improvements in the UK. Yeah, they changed a lot of dirty energy generating energy processes by, for instance, electricity generation by gas. That is much cleaner. But another part is also outsourcing industries to China. And to capture that, you need, of course, then a multi-regional input-output table. So I think most of you are familiar with that, but roughly you can say it looks like this. This is for 4 countries. You have the supply and use table here, the intermediate part on the diagonal. Here you have the trade between the countries. There you have the final consumption. There you have the imports for final consumption. But what is also nice, here you have the environmental extensions, like resource extraction, emissions, and all this kind of stuff. And of course, this is a group of people that is mainly interested in economic analysis. And of course, you know, actually much better than I, because I'm just an environmental professor. Here you have the value-added block with, you know, things like profit, jobs, and that kind of stuff. So again, and if you do your analysis then, you can basically say, like, yeah, if we know the emissions per euro or per dollar in a certain industry, in a certain country, but if I use the Leontief inverse and I calculate backwards what a euro of consumption of, say, a rice in Europe, how this value chain is distributed over the different countries, and I then say, okay, there is so much rice production there, there was so much fertilizer input or something like that, and I know all the emissions of that, then you actually have the life cycle emissions of this ton of rice or this amount of rice consumed here in Europe. You have them. And what I like about the system is that you cannot lose any emission, you cannot lose any resource. It's all accounted for here, for the whole world. And the only thing what you do with this intermediate block and this is a kind of reallocating which country, which consumption category is actually responsible for which country emissions in which countries. Okay, as I will show later, there are a lot of people making now these multi-regional input-output databases. When we started with this 10 years ago, of course, we did it from an environmental background. And it was quite clear for us that a sector like agriculture, it really makes a lot of difference if you eat rice or if you eat meat. Yeah, so you cannot lump that all together in one agricultural sector. If you want to make little scenarios like what happens if the diet, if the final demand in a country changes from a more meat-based diet to another type of diet that is more based on vegetables. I mean, I need an agricultural sector that discerns all these kind of different food categories. Well, as all of you know, as good economics, I think in the US or in Europe, the whole agricultural sector is 5% of your economy. So from an economic perspective, there is no really need to be very precise there or to make a lot of detail. But for my type of work, it really is. The same happens with electricity generation. There I want to see specifically, do I generate my electricity with coal, with gas? Maybe as wind energy or with solar cells. That really makes an enormous difference in the impacts for the electricity generated. Think about mining and the further refining steps. It really makes a whole lot of difference if you extract iron ore or bauxite and you process that, or copper for that matter. So again, you want to see the specific mining sectors in your table. Well, then a review of the tables that I'm aware of. We actually did that in a special issue of the journal that Erik Dietzenbacher has been editor-in-chief from, Economic System Research. It's the XI-based consortium, that is where I work, that I mainly had, with groups like one of the companies I worked for, TNO, a large not-for-profit organization, Leiden University, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Vienna University. We did a lot of projects actually for Eurostat in trying to help them to compile the data set, but I think the main issue is that we did, funded by the EU, and of course it was all competitive, so we are proud to have gotten all this money, but we in total got something like 50 million euros spread over 4 projects to do all this work. What we put together at the moment is a database that has 160 sectors or 200 product groups by country, where we discern 43 economies in the world, plus 5 rest of continents. The 43 are of course the big ones. Since we are European-based projects, we discern all the European countries. But we cover with this something like 95% of the global economy. We are building time series also based on the UN main aggregates, and we calculate 40 emissions. We have 80 resources in it by sector: land, water, value added, employment, and so on. And we still try to work on various assessment methods that are relevant from an environmental perspective. You can imagine if you extract water, it makes really a difference if you do it in the Netherlands where you don't have water scarcity, or somewhere in a place where you have a lot of scarcity, so we need to, let's say, make that geographically explicit. Biodiversity is very difficult to measure, so that is all kind of work that we still do as well. Of course, we're not alone. There is a professor that actually made with me a presentation for the UNCEA 4 months ago. He developed what is called the so-called EORA database. I'm not going into detail how he did it, but his philosophy was slightly different. He uses all the supply and use tables as they are, did not harmonize them, and links them directly via trade. So he gets a heterogeneous sector classification, but in total he has all the countries, and that is a total sector detail at world level that is quite impressive. And then of course we have other databases that probably this community is much more familiar with, like the WIO database, first developed by Groningen University with a lot of other players. I think, I'm not sure, Nadine, but I think that was the kind of inspiration for your work on trade in value added. I think it was a kind of, transformed into the TIVA database, but maybe you can explain it later how it really worked. I think many of you have worked with the GDAP database. That is probably one of the pioneering things that is around already for 20 or 30 years, set up by Purdue University. And we have a number of other players. But I think one of the big differences between what I and Manfred Lenssen have been doing is this incredible kind of emphasis on detail in environmental sectors. And I will show you now a number of illustrative results from a booklet that we produced in months of the project. It can be downloaded from the places where I indicated on the slide. We presented that during the Green Week of the European Commission. That is one of the biggest conferences on environment and the biggest one that's sponsored for the EU. And what we basically have there is carbon, land, water and material footprints of 43 countries, and we did all kind of nice analysis with it. To give one example, maybe I should concentrate here on the water footprint. What does the water footprint tells you? It actually says, like on for you on the the left side, you see the water extraction globally. That is about, I think, for blue water that is coming from rivers and groundwater, that is about 3 cubic kilometers. Well, in the EU, we extract 7% of that. In APAC, that is Asia Pacific, that is about 43%. China, 16%. So actually, this is, if you like, the production-oriented view. This is where the extraction happens. But then, if you really have a closer look in, let's say, the water embodied in the products that we consume, you get this thing, the consumption of goods and services, and the water that was needed to produce them. And then you see something funny. The EU actually consumes 12.7% of the global water extraction, where we extract only 7%. So we rely on water that is actually extracted elsewhere. I already gave the example of carbon, but what is really stunning is land. I mean, I thought Europe has stopped, let's say, colonizing other countries or something like that. And of course, in the literal sense of the word, we have done that. But to match our consumption, we need actually 12.6% of the land surface on Earth, where we are only about, 5%. So we need more than double the amount of land that we have ourselves to satisfy our needs. Well, to some extent that is logical, but at the same time that gives us as Europeans a responsibility. You want to have that the land that you use abroad, that the people who do all the production processes there can do that in a very sustainable manner. And that is what these kind of analysis help you to show. We have calculated the per capita footprints again. Pink is carbon, blue is water, green is land. And of course this is very detailed. If you're interested in that, go to the booklet. But again, what you basically see is that the rich countries have a high footprint per capita for virtually everything. And the poor countries, they don't consume that much of the natural resources that we have. Trade of embodied carbon, you can make these kind of nice pictures, and I just make here a comparison of Europe, the US and China. And what you particularly see is that the carbon emissions in China, they are about 7.3 gigatons in the base year that we had, 2007. The domestic emissions were 9.3 gigatons, so that looks quite bad. But 2 gigatons, actually more than 20% of these emissions are actually made to satisfy needs outside China. And of course, the flip side is then Europe and the US. We actually import all that embodied carbon. And then we have done things like, we also looked at things like, okay, does it really mean, do you really need a high consumption of resources to have a good quality of life and a high human development index? So we made very simple plots between the Human Development Index and what is called the Happy Life Year indicator against carbon footprint, water footprint and so on. And again, you see something stunning. Of course, when you don't consume a lot, you don't have a good quality of life. That is pretty clear. So all the developing countries they need to grow economically, they probably need more resources than they use now. But you also see there's a kind of turning point here. So I think this is France or a few countries. You see a number of countries that have quite a good, actually a very good human development index. And countries that use more resources actually do not improve anymore in human development index. So that says something about how to organize your society and how to do more with less. And of course, I don't know all the details. Why is that? But it really gives very nice handles for further analysis. Country fact sheets. You can look to the footprint by country, how it is with embodied imports and all this kind of stuff. But in the few minutes I still have left, I want to move on now. If you really want, because one of the drawbacks of what we have done, this is a scientific database. It's not an official one. And I think we need to go to a situation where we have a kind of an official thing endorsed by, I don't care, OECD, United Nations Statistical Division, Eurostat. I would love to see them all together to work with us to see how can we really make these kind of databases for different purposes in an official way. I will skip through this quite quickly, but here I have a number of figures where I show that detail is highly important. What we did here is we looked at what happens with your material footprint if you calculate it by country. If you just distinguish 60 materials category, that is the red bar, or the green bar, that is 46 material categories. You see that for countries like Belgium, the footprint, the material footprint of the country, all of a sudden changes 50%. So this shows for me more detail is more precise. And I will skip a few other ones. But that is actually a very important message. For the type of analysis that I do, environmental analysis, you need detail. Well, then how do we build these databases? We are very lucky. When it comes down to, let's say, resource extraction, we have a number of great databases. People are even putting that together now and harmonizing that from the FAO, International Energy Agency, USGS, to really look at resources. You basically have it. There needs to be some gap filling, but that is not a major effort. The energy emissions, actually what we do, we use the EEA database allocated to using sectors, and then we have huge databases with emission factors, and then you can calculate them. This is a very short story about a very complex thing that costs us normally a few €100,000 or man year to do. But the good news here is that countries that don't have all their own statistics actually can use these generic statistics from these big international organizations and complete their input-output tables with environmental extensions. That is quite doable with a limited effort. And then, of course, we have the input-output tables. I would say that for many countries, they have them. They are not harmonized. That is a difficulty. That is the work that the OECD is always doing, what I'm doing, and all this kind of stuff. But it is there. And there are trade data. So you can make, and I will show later how, you can make these multi-regional input-output tables. And if you then combine that with the extension that I just showed, you have the things that we need for detailed environmental and also economic assessments. I will skip this one. Oh, that goes. Oh, yeah. Now, maybe a word about how we do the detailing. It's quite technical. We basically have often tables of 60 sectors. We use then product statistics like Prodcom in Europe or industry statistics like structural business statistics to split up the rows and the columns in your supply and use tables. And then, of course, you don't know your intermediate transactions that you have there. But often, you know from other countries with detailed input-output or supply-use tables, you have some idea about the coefficients, the inputs and the output coefficients. So you can start to play around with that, use techniques like RAS to actually estimate the tables at the detail that are relevant for us, and that is how we work that. We have largely automated that, so we can do that actually quite quickly now. Okay. That's all fine. And then another big issue is that we need all to link these tables via trade. How we do that is we say actually that the supply and use tables, we declare them as a kind of secret. We don't want to mess around with the imports and the exports in the supply and use tables. We use the Comtrade database, or an adjusted version of that, BAKI, to look at where the imports come from. So we just use the trade shares. That gives you then from each product a virtual export from all the countries that of course does not match the export in the supply and use table of that country. Then again, you need a kind of RAS kind of procedure to balance the whole table. That is also automated and that reasonably works. And what I want to say here is that these bilateral trade data, they are nice, but not essential, because all the databases that I know, Axiobase, WIOT, EORA, they all start with country supply and use tables, and they say that is relevant. And we use just the trade data to see where the stuff comes from and where it goes to. The alternative is that you say, I trust the trade data, but then I override the trade in my supply and use table. And you have to actually rebalance the supply and use table. You do nasty things like adjusting GDP, value added, and that kind of stuff. And usually you don't want to do that. And the real problem in my view is that when you look at global trade, in all the supply and use tables in the world, at the global level, all the products together, it's not too bad. You see a difference of 0.2%. But when you look at specific products, it's really bad. It can be up to 100%. And Comtrade cannot solve that. You need to solve that by going back to the supply and use table suppliers and to see if it is misclassifications in the supply and use tables, these kind of things. This is one of the most problematic areas in my view to do this. I come now to an end, maybe 2 minutes, to see how can the statistical community that is clearly interested in that, I see, and join forces. I have 0 minutes, but I think, Ivo, this is the most important part for your agenda. So hopefully I can get time to go talk you through these 3 slides. At this moment, I see that most of these multi-regional input-output tables are made by scientists. But maybe at this moment, since 1 or 2 years, the exception is the TIVA database that now is endorsed by the OECD. That implies that we often use data that we have to adjust, where maybe statistical officers have better insight what could be wrong or how it should be adjusted to harmonize it at the global level. And you want to improve that. There are all kinds of inconsistencies between the FAO stat data, the EEA data, and that we find in the supply and use tables of national statistical institutes. And that are all kinds of things that you want to solve. You want to have a platform for that. And how I think that could be done is the following. If you really want to have a detailed global multi-regional environmental extended input-output table, I think what you should do is put together people from the statistical division of the UN, the OECD, the World Trade Organization, interested national statistical officers, and then a number of these scientists that have tried to do all these harmonizations, have developed all kind of nice tools, but only have a certain limit because they don't know in detail what kind of data you have gathered. And what they could do is put together the best available SUT and IOT and auxiliary data, do cross-checks, if the detailing makes sense, if the harmonization makes sense. And what we could do as scientists, we have all these detailing and harmonization tools. Well, we could share them with you. We could also say these are the big issues that need to be solved. We cannot solve them. I mean, we make our estimates, but you guys are the experts. You really know it much better. Another way that I was thinking that we could move forward, one of, I think at this moment, the disadvantages of TIVA is that it's quite aggregated. So for my environmental assessments, I have difficulty using it. I cannot do the scenarios I want. But maybe it is an idea that this statistical community that is gathered here says, well, we are happy with TIVA or a database like that. But then that we do, with the detailing tools that we have, we go to the level of detail for environmental analysis. Then possible financing organization. You typically talk about budgets, millions of euro. That is the kind of projects that I have. But actually there is a lot of ongoing. I myself am still working on 2 big projects totaling 6 million that are ongoing. That is funding I can use for this kind of work. There are proposals submitted and so on. But there are other sources that you really could use. For many parts of the world, the EU has big programs called, for instance, Europe Aid, Switch Asia or SwitchMed. There are similar programs for Latin America, where they try to help countries to build up infrastructure and all this kind of stuff. Well, I would say apply for one of these projects and you probably are done. You have the funding and you have the manpower to do that. What you also could think about, I know that quite a lot of statistical officers sometimes second people to Evo and all this kind of stuff, that also is manpower. And the third route that I'm thinking about is that I would be happy, together with maybe the University of Sydney or maybe even the OECD, if you have 8 PhD students or 10 PhD students, you really come a long way. A lot of the countries that I work with, China, India, Indonesia, they have these PhD stipend programs. Why not say, here we are, the international statistical community combined with scientists. We just want to have a PhD program on this area. Please make sure that 1 or 2 PhDs from your program can work on this. And then again, I think you basically make them available so much capacity that things can be done. Well, let's stop here. I mean, this is more or less where I try to wrap up. But I would say this is more or less my view on things, and I really can hope that the next few days we can work out a few of these kind of ideas with all of you. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you, Arnold. I think it is an excellent opening gambit of the way you have presented the various sort of views on the extended global supply and use table. As said, we would open it for the floor for some immediate questions related to Arnold's presentation. May I invite the floor to maybe pose a question? Yes, sir.
Simple question. Is the data you put together for the 160 sectors and 200 products, is it public available, like the VIAD or like the...
Take this one.
Yeah, I'll take this one. I must confess, when we did the first database, we didn't know if we would get additional funding. So then we thought maybe we are going to be as good as GTAP, you know, in basically selling it. Didn't work. So what we do now is that we want to link it to one big LCA database. That's why I did not make it public, because I want to finalize that kind of talk first. But really, the 2007 database at some point, and you really talk about weeks, will be made public. Yeah.
Anybody else at this point? No? Yes. Go ahead, Pat.
I very much enjoyed it. When I tend to think of the global supply use table, particularly when in the context of environmental issues, I try to think also about integrative trade and investment. And one of the things that came to mind, perhaps as a supplement to your work that I think might be interesting, is to maybe sort of connect with and try and leverage some of the work that the OECD is doing on environmental sustainability, particularly on the green FDI as maybe a transmission mechanism for a sustainable technology, and of course perhaps it's inverse. And I think it's the inverse that's maybe slowed some of the progress at the OECD. But I think we should go down that road, because I think understanding the transmission mechanisms are quite important. So I just want to know if you'd consider that. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, actually Miriam Linster from the Environmental Directorate organized a workshop about 2 months ago about also resources. And I think indeed, that is the way to go. I should not stay as a scientist, a group of scientists, alone doing this. It should at some point go to these official institutions. And if you can link it to the issues that you indicate, I fully agree. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Nadim, you want to come in?
Well, I'll just...
Is that working?
I think so. Is it working?
Now
yeah.
it is, of course.
Just a few follow-up points that just to reassure you in terms of the broader direction of the work. You'll be happy to see, I guess, in my presentation that when we refer to some of the thorny issues that you presented in your presentation, that there are plans afoot to try to tackle some of those issues. You raised, I guess, the issue of heterogeneity in a slightly different way to what we would approach it within our work program going forward, and you referring fundamentally to the heterogeneity that you see in production functions. So you look, for example, at the different resource intensities of different firms within a given sector. I think the key issue, of course, when we're talking about footprints is the heterogeneity that you observe between the firms and their export intensities, because that's where you observe the true global value chain dimension. If of course heterogeneity within production functions had no export channel, then of course the footprint in the production is the same.
Sure.
The challenge, of course, is trying to make sure that the chain is what you can measure. And so the focus of our work is really to tackle heterogeneity in the context of looking at the trading intensity of different firms. And so that will be of great benefit to your work. I mean, certainly, of course, there are areas that we will have to explore in the goodness of time as our work develops to make sure that we cover a broader agenda. I mean, at the moment, of course, the focus is fundamentally on looking at the economic aspects of global value chains, looking at value added and jobs, and also things like income. But increasingly, of course, we'll have to take a look at things like the footprint type approach. And that will mean perhaps looking again at the industry classification system that we use within our tables. And just to say a very quick word in terms of the approach that we've used at the OECD, we try to make sure that everything that we do is based and grounded on official statistics. And so the harmonization of the input-output tables that you referred to, of course, looks at what's available at the national level. And so the challenge that we have, of course, is similar to yours, that very often there's an aggregation of firms that are heterogeneous in their production functions. And so mining, in particular, is one of them. I'm not sure how far you'll get with electricity, or the generation, because of course there's certainly challenges in terms of the carbon intensity of different firms, but I'm not sure you're ever going to be able to collect information that shows how firms use electricity that's been generated from different types of emissions, and that's a real challenge, and it's a real challenge, I guess, in terms of the environmental literature more generally. I mean, just to say that we have a long-standing interest in this area of work. I mean, in 2003, we produced estimates of carbon footprints using the input-output tables at the OECD, creating, if you want, our first attempt at a multi-regional input-output table, and it covered about 95% of global trade and about 90% of GDP. So that was the first estimate, and now, of course, we've mainstreamed that activity by producing footprint estimates for carbon dioxide as part of, as you're aware, our green growth agenda. So anyway, that's just a few observations. One final comment in terms of perhaps the confusion that's often been there in terms of WIOD vis-a-vis the OECD. We've had a very close working relationship with WIOD from the beginning. We provided input-output tables for OECD countries to the initiative, but certainly, whilst we can look at the TIVA project as being an extension, it's also to some extent a channel that was always there in the first place. We've been working in the field of input-output tables for 2 decades now, and been developing, if you want, the background to this model that's now generated TIVA results for close to 10 years, and certainly for the last 4.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think, of course, I mean, I agree with all what you said, because there were mainly clarifications. I think you pointed at one point that probably is another thorny issue that they didn't frame in that way. You said rightly that you try to be as close as possible to official statistics. And I feel compelled often to move a bit away of that, if you like. I mean, to put it blunt, the mining is maybe an important example. I mean, I'm not afraid of doing things like, okay, you have extraction data, you know roughly something about prices, and then you say, well, then this country probably produces so much iron ore, so much bauxite, so much that, so much that, so much that. So then at least, as industry totals, I know how to split up the mining sector. I think anyone from a statistical office probably would say, not good, eh? You should not do that anymore. But I then have to say, yeah, sorry, I need this data. And I think if you really want to go into environmental issues, you either do it in a way, as we have done, that you use all kind of auxiliary statistics, and you try to make a reasonable estimate of how a detailed supply and use table would look like, because we need that for the clear reasons that I indicated. Or you go the other way around and you try to convince national statistical offices who have huge detail, you know, behind that, but they often are a bit afraid to show that, or there are of course confidentiality issues, to say, well, how far can you go? Particularly with these kind of sectors. And maybe that's another point that you guys from the statistical division and OECD could try to put on your agenda, because I certainly don't have the power to do that. You may have, I don't know.
No, thank you, Arnold. I think you went to the heart of some of the issues. I'm just very conscious that we're running just a short intervention, because I want to really move on.
Yes, a very short one.
D'accord.
I completely agree with the problem of heterogeneity and diversity of production function, but I want also to point out one thing about footprint. I think that you spoke about a production view, and you spoke about a consumption view. But there is a third view, which would be an ownership view. For example, ownership view. like ownership trade balances. For example, I'm from France. If you imagine a tire firm, Michelin, who produce in Brazil to serve third market, USA, so you can put it on Brazil because it is produced on Brazil, but you can also necessitate to know that it is decided from France or for Norway or others.
Very quick, I mean, of course I've been dreaming about this global input-output table of the world for the Fortune 500, yeah? Can you imagine that you have the Fortune 500 companies and try to see how they relate together? But okay, that is another 20 PhDs down the line. And, but I agree. It's highly interesting. Yeah.
No, absolutely, and you make the step to, you know, resident principle versus nationality principle, and that's where you're basically going at. So that's definitely part of the schematics that we will talk about later on, also in the different, you know, spectrum from micro to national to in different presentation at the resident versus nationality principle. I think you set the stage very well. Thank you very much, Arnold. Well done. And you brought out many of the issues that we will tease out, I think, during this conference. But with that, I want to move to Jaakko. Let me introduce Jaakko briefly. He is a senior fellow in the Energy, Environment and Resource Department of Chatham House, specializing in the political economy of natural resources and global commodity markets, with particular interest in mining and metals. With that, I also would like to maybe introduce a little bit what Chatham House is about. The other name for Chatham House is the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and those who work in diplomacy like ourselves, you know, there's the so-called Chatham House rules. Maybe you should explain that a little bit. Everything that that happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. We have it also in the diplomatic environment, and then we work on the Chatham House rules. That is where this Royal Institute was very famous for. It was founded in 1920, for those who are interested, and it engages with governments, the private sector, civil society, and members to create an open debate. And they've been particularly interested in the last few years to basically take this area forward, and they've worked tremendously also in looking at these data and looking at issues of asymmetries and developing similar sort of insight for the political economy around natural resources. With that, Jaakko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work here today. I'm going to talk on Wednesday a little bit more about what we did with trade data. Today I'm really trying to give you a picture of how data generally is used in policy making and how that relationship between policy making and data is changing. So I'm really somebody that shouldn't really be here. I think if you would go with the rock star analogy that Arnold made, then I think I should have gone first. But to explain a little bit what we do, our daily bread is really policy making and policy advice. And so if I can maybe give you a user perspective for those that need to make your work digestible to policymakers, that's our daily bread. Now, let me just start with this graph that we nowadays refer to as the tube map. This is looking at the global trade and natural resources, and what you see in gray was how the world looked like in 2000, and what you see in the colorful world is in the colors is how the world looks like in 2010. And if you would go to 2014, you would see even more color. Now, what you see is that the political economy of natural resources globally is changing very, very quickly. New streams are emerging. For example, I just highlight here Australia to China, iron ore and coal, huge quantities that are now moving there, and that streams that did not used to exist before. Global value chains, new global value chains that are emerging, and that creates a whole new set of political economy type questions. And if you look at these value chains, you will often find that they come with environmental implications, they come with political implications, both at the source during the transport and also in the among the end users. So what we tried to do 4 years ago, and that's maybe the reason why I'm standing at this conference today, is we tried to, we started a big new project and said, okay, we need to understand the political economy of natural resources, which is our daily bread, in a new way, and try and understand what that means for policymakers. So what we went out there. We're not the type of people that want to do a lot of work. What we do usually is we will go out and find people like you that work very hard and to tell us what we should tell policymakers. Now in this case, unfortunately, we went back and tried to see, okay, how can we really track the global flow of natural resources, and what kind of data do we have available to do this? And so we went through all of the statistical sources that are out there, and in the end, I went to my boss and I said, look, we will have no alternative. We have to deal with Comtrade, and then I went onto a long list of reasons why that would cost us months and months of work and would be very difficult to do, and basically tried to convince my boss not to go down that route. And I still remember a chat in St. James's Square with my former boss, who's now the head of climate change at the World Economic Forum, and she listened to all those reasons and she said, but I think we'll actually have to do that. So policy making really can't wait for the statistics community. We needed that data then because there was a very important debate about how the world of natural resources is changing and what that means for international affairs and kind of big politics that we read in newspapers about. And we needed to produce answers then and there. So what we did at the time was to try and make Comtrade as user-friendly to us as possible in terms of harmonizing bilateral trade flows, looking at reliability issues, looking at accuracy issues, and we can talk more about that on Wednesday. But the lesson here is that policy needs an increasing amount of data, and it needs an increasing amount of data very fast. Now, I'm going to skip this slide. This is basically about why trade data is important when you ask political economy questions about natural resources, but it can be about supply security concerns, environmental pressures, like Arnold mentioned them already, new technologies and policy interventions. So, for example, what does the emergence of shale gas mean for global energy trade flows and the political economy of energy? Illegal resource trade and production, so the questions about what happens to conflict minerals that are dug up somewhere in the DRC, where do they go and where do they end up in the product, and where do those products then end up, and what can we do about that in terms of policy making. So a lot of thorny issues that one has to deal with, that one needs good, reliable, accurate, detailed trade statistics. Now, to summarize, what policymakers really want from data is data that's easily accessible, comprehensive in coverage, accurate and reliable, up-to-date, and forward-looking. Now, a little bit cheeky, I put here what the data that policymakers get is often difficult to find and interpret. It's piecemeal and often has large gaps. It's often estimated data with some with a big degree of uncertainty about how reliable is that data that I'm looking at. Okay, I downloaded that data set, I made that nice graph, it seems to show this, but does it actually show this, or is it down to measurement errors, or what's the problem here? We want up-to-date data, we get 2010. We want forward-looking data, we often get backward-looking data. So, and one of the problems is that in the areas that often most salient for policymakers, data is hardest to get by. And you can think about that in terms of the global value chains, land grabbing, discussions around cartels and investment. So I just give you here one example, which is the land matrix, which was a big data exercise that tried to look at land grabbing. So if you're familiar with the OECD, with the FAO data around agriculture, you will see that there's a big wealth of very detailed data available. But one of the big debates in the last couple of years about agriculture has been this practice of land grabbing. So people going out and making big investments, buying huge plots of land, and either for commercial gain or for supply security, often in countries that have well, let's say less robust institutional frameworks, and where there's questions about, were locals consulted or not when this land was taken. Now, if you go to the FAO today, there is no data on that. It's as simple as that. So the question about where does land grabbing happen, so we read about land grabbing in newspapers, but where does land grabbing happen, who land grabs, and who is affected by that, and what does that mean for equity and social sustainability, environmental questions, peace and conflict, that is something that one couldn't answer. So the land matrix is a collaboration of various institutions and people coming together trying to answer that question. And they did a lot of detailed work on going through newspaper articles and so on and so forth to try and track where land was being grabbed. Now, I think this is an exercise that received a lot of public attention. Problem with that was that if you look at the data, the accuracy and reliability of the statistics is not good enough to make actual policy making on it. So people were looking at it, people wanted to come up with new rules, but if you actually look at those cases in detail, what you read in the newspaper is oftentimes not what happened on the ground. So there is no way around official statistics, land cadastres, and so on and so forth, but that information is not available, and that means that until today there is not a lot of policy making happening around an issue that policymakers think is an urgent policy priority, but we can't really do much about it because of the lack of data. And that's this absence of reliable shared data is often a source of tensions and impedes effective policy making. So land grabbing is one example, but there's many other examples where you can show if you do not have accurate data available, you cannot come to a shared perspective about the scale and scope of policy challenges. You cannot effectively negotiate sharing of burdens and benefits. So the climate example that Arnold made is a good example there. If you have not a clear picture, okay, who actually consumes this in the end, should I look at the production side or at the consumption side, then if we make in a big global climate deal, then the question about who should share the burden and who should be allowed to emit how much carbon gets very difficult to negotiate. And you get this kind of conflicting narratives about what is actually going on the ground that makes effective policy making often very, very difficult. So I have just two pictures here. One is about illegal logging. It's just, I punched illegal logging into Google and this picture came up. Maybe these guys are perfectly a perfectly legal operation. But so anyways, but again, in illegal logging, I have a lot of people in my department that work on these questions. Where illegal logging happens and what the trends in illegal logging are is a very tricky question. Nobody knows. So does illegal logging in countries where we have concerns, does it actually go up or down? A simple question like that is, with today's data that we have available, simply not answerable. And that creates problems for policymakers because then the question becomes, okay, what should we do? Well, let's say you will need a lot of patience and a lot of kind of knowledge to get there. A comp rate may be slightly better, but still I think a long way to go before I, as somebody that has no interest in statistical concepts, is able to go on the website and say, okay, give me, this is what I want to understand, I don't know, the global trade in wheat, and I push a button and it comes up. FAO has done some efforts in that direction, but I think it's still from somebody that comes from outside of the community, the effort that is necessary to engage with it is the threshold is still very high. And I think what is key here is that you need to come to simpler messages, and the statistics community needs to work hard to distill messages. This is a slide that we use in China a lot. We're doing a lot of work in China and looking at the imports of natural resources, again coming out of that database. So obviously there's 10 or 15 million data points in that database, but what we try and boil this down to is this very simple slide which says, well, China in 2011 was already importing $660 billion worth of natural resources, and when you're looking at the next 5-year period, it's going to be closer to $1 trillion. So once a politician hears $1 trillion, that captures attention, and people start thinking about this. What does this mean? Okay, well, the question then becomes, okay, what does this mean for the global value chains that we're talking about? But it also raises questions like, you know, if you are able to do 10% demand side efficiency, 10% production side efficiency, over the period of the next 5-year plan, you can save $1 trillion. Now that is something that makes people pay attention. So clear and engaging visualizations are key to engage broader audiences. This is some of the graphics that came up out of that work with that trade data. It went into a big report that is available for download, and actually became recognized as some of the top policy reports of the last couple of years. And I think an important part of that was that we spent a lot of time and effort sitting down with designers, making data look pretty. It is not so important for you and me that produce that data. We know what the data is showing, but actually communicating it to the outside world, you need data to look good. This is a slightly more sophisticated exercise where we're looking at coal trade from China to the outside world. So we try to create an interactive microsite that takes you through the messages of the report. And what you see here is coal trade from China in 2000, when China was still a net exporter with big export streams to Japan and Taiwan. Now, if you look at this, 2010, the situation has reversed. China is a net importer, and you have these large new flows from Australia, from Indonesia, with all kinds of policy and economic consequences. Now, it also means that you need to carry the data out into the world. So in this case, we worked with media organizations like the FT or the Times, and went out there and really tried to make the data accessible to them. So we spent a week working with the guys from the FT. They knew the report was coming out. They were interested in it. They said, okay, this trade data is great, but we want to find ways to make it accessible. And they actually built this interactive tool, which where you can click around and see where copper flows to in the world. But that requires engagement from your side. It was not the FT that called us up. It was us that called the FT up and said, let's do this. Now, I'm going to run through this rather quickly. It's also about using new types of data, so simple annual statistics from yearbooks and so on and so forth are no longer sufficient. You need to now make that type of data talk to data, satellite imaging or geospatial data, for example, about water or, in this case, conflict minerals. And we are at the moment trying to figure out, okay, supply chain bottlenecks. And you see, okay, you then need to start taking what Comtrade produces, and you need to start matching that with shipping data, which comes from satellites. Now, trying to make those data sets talk to each other is a big challenge, and there's also new trends around community and user-led reporting of data, where people walk around with their smartphones and basically can say, okay, there's illegal logging happening in my forest, and that is then talking to satellite data on deforestation. That's something that the World Resource Institute is doing at the moment. But so there's all these new angles out there on how you connect this growing number of different types of sources of data. Now this is my last slide here, and I think that while the pressure is growing on the statistics community to go outside, communicate with the outside world, become more jazzy, if you want so, and more flashing images and nice pictures. At the same time, there is a growing pressure on data accuracy, reliability, and transparency. And what you see in the policy community nowadays, if you want to go after somebody's policy narratives or the arguments that are being made, oftentimes people actually go after the data sources. So these are two examples in macroeconomic policy making. One is the Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, who did a lot of work about the indebtedness of countries, and it became very, very influential in policy circles. And the second one is the recent book by Piketty on inequality, that again made a major splash in the policy community. In both cases, people went after the spreadsheets that these people had put online, which is already a big change to how the world used to be, and questioned the accuracy of the data and the accuracy of the statistical conclusions that were drawn from it. So At the same time, while you're under pressure to make data available in new ways, make it more accessible, the pressure is rising from the other side to make it more transparent, more accurate, more reliable. And that means that, so to conclude really, the situation that we're facing is that when we're looking at the environment and resources, there's growing pressures that come from globalization, industrialization, urbanization of large parts of the world. Now, that creates urgent policy pressures. These are issues that need to be dealt with, and they create problems every day. And every day when you open a newspaper, you will see these stories. That, in turn, creates pressure on the statistics and data community. Policymakers will increasingly come to you and ask for answers, and they need the answers now, and they want reliable, transparent, comprehensive data, and they want you to explain to policymakers what those data mean. So it's an incredible, I think what I'm trying to really sketch here is this picture of a lot of pressure on the community, on the statistics and data community to move forward and do all these things that Arnold was talking about, and a question about how do you get to supply use tables and reconcile trade flows, and how you make all of that work. So yeah, that's where I want to leave it at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaakko, for providing that political economy perspective and indicating very strongly that the statistical community apparently has to step up. And I think that's one of the elements that we will talk probably throughout the conference, is that there's a challenge to meet these requirements sooner than later, and carve out a road towards achieving that demand for that data earlier than later. At least provide a response that we're working on it to those policymakers, and that these data will become on stream at some point of time in the different organizations at country level and at international institutions. I would like to open it up maybe for some additional questions to Jaakko, maybe to address now. Yes, Eduardo. Yeah, you can steal mine.
What will be the challenges in releasing the data on international trade? We release the data on 6 digits by product, by country. Is it the same in all countries? I do remember that in the case of Colombia, they release even the micro data, that is by company. Is there a, what, I mean, are we on the statistical community really releasing the micro data at what level? And if that's the case for all countries, or are there challenges, or are there things that we need to do more in the statistical community?
I think I'm not going to answer the question in terms of, okay, at what level should the data be available? I think the key point that I'm trying to make is that it will not be enough to simply go and dump 20 million data points onto the internet. It is really about making that data accessible and intelligible to people that don't know much about how global trade statistics work, come with rather unsophisticated questions to the data, and finding ways to guide people through that is, I think, one of the major challenges. So how, and there's some interesting work happening around that at the World Bank, at the OECD, at the FAO, where people experiment with new ways of exploring data. And I think that is, in a way, one of the key challenges is, how do you make it easier to use? How do you make it clearer? How do you make it easier to navigate? Because otherwise, the result is simply that people then switch off, and then the data might be there, and people do not use it.
Thank you. I would just like to make an advertisement for the United Nations trade data. If you go to UNCTAD or Globstat, you will have in a few mouse clicks the graph that you showed on China, and it's quite easy. There's a trade matrix which is on the basis of 3-digit SITC by year from 1995 to 2012 or so, and I think if you look for data on raw materials, that's quite okay 3-digit SITC. With regard to what you said about illegal logging, there's under the UNEP umbrella, there's a program which is called CITES, which is International Trade on Endangered Species. There you would find data on the quota that you would be allowed to export from Indonesia, for example. And then if you look at what's happening there in the media, I think you can have an indication. Now, with respect to the diagram that you showed at the beginning about the trade flows, I wonder if it wouldn't be illustrative if you added the reserves to that, which would indicate you to what extent or how long these trade flows may actually be sustainable. So it would allow you to move a little bit from the backward-looking perspective to the forward-looking perspective. And I think if you focus on international relations, it would also be interested if you added data on flows of resource rents. Like if you have exports of oil from certain places in Africa to China, you would, or the United States or Europe or wherever, you would expect that you would have a financial flow in the other direction. And if you could find the numbers of that and add to the diagram, I think it would be quite illustrative for international relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I do recognize a lot of the points that you have been making about alternative sources of data, UNCTAD Stat, for example. I think the problem that you're often facing is that you want to move very quickly from something that is a very aggregate picture that we have there, and then say, okay, yeah, but I'm interested in this flow, and then I want to break it down, and then suddenly 3 digits is no longer enough. I want it at 6 digits, and I want to drill down, really. I don't want any more a regional perspective. I want to know exactly from which country it's coming from. I want to change the time dimension, and that is something that is just quite difficult to do in terms of a website. Now, just on the logging side, it is very true that information is available, but my colleagues that spend their lifetime on logging questions have regular heated exchange with, for example, the government of Indonesia about, okay, what do those statistics actually show us? Okay, well, should you count forests that come from land conversion also as part of illegal logging or not? Is the land conversion legal or illegal? Now, these are all tricky kind of questions that I, as a policymaker, I want the answers. I don't want to delve into into the detail of it. So the question then becomes, okay, how do you communicate that accuracy and reliability more strongly? Now, one point that I still wanted to make, my talk was in no way intended to. I think what I tried to show is where the bar is set at the moment in terms of policy making. This is not to say that all those efforts that have been going on at Eurostat, at OECD, at Comtrade, and the decades of work that stand behind those data, that they are not very, very valuable in their own right. I think it's very, very important for anybody that goes out and works with data firsthand, knows how much time and effort goes into something that looks like a simple statistic. And I think that is something that policymakers oftentimes do not understand. But that doesn't, in a way, that doesn't help the conversation. I think it's still important to recognize that in the world that we live in today and the pressures that we're facing environmental questions, international relations questions, economic questions, the bar for data is set quite high. And I think in that sense, I would go with what Eva concluded, indeed, that a step up is required to make all of that valuable information and data that's out there more user-friendly, more accurate, more connected, and really make it talk to each other.
You want to come in, Nadim? Yeah.
It's a very quick observation. Eduardo made a very important point, and I think that the issue of microdata really it cuts to the heart of the discussions that we'll have over the next couple of days. And one of the things I think we always need to keep in mind as we go forward, of course, is that what we can do will always be restricted by the ability to show detailed levels of data. Now, of course, there are different mechanisms by which microdata can be made accessible. You can make it accessible within a research lab to dedicated researchers that can produce results. But they will never be able to show the microdata. Now, of course, another option, and both of these options are options that were pursued by the OECD expert group on microdata. Another option, of course, is to make better use of the microdata that we have available by looking at how we can create synergies across data sets to create this integrated set of economic accounts that both Steve and I will be talking about later on.
Yeah. Well, Ronald.
Thank you. So thank you for the presentations. I was just wanted to come in with a comment, given the fact that you raised Comtrade a number of times. So as sitting on Comtrade, I would like to make some remarks on that, and also come back to the comment from Dr. Sojo. So we will try to make as much detail available with Comtrade as we can. Now, the international standard for harmonized system is 6 digits, so that's how we can compare. Beyond 6 digits would be interesting, but it's more difficult to start comparing this. So we have data at a more detailed level, but what it means, the codes at those levels is different between countries, so that needs some harmonization. That's difficult to do. But it could be made available in a sense that researchers could explore it, and that's something which we might look into. Regarding company information, I think what we want is something systematic on companies. So you would like to know what the economic activity is, or what classification is being used, and we will have in Comtrade trade by ISIC. If countries give us the data, we will go after that. Another thing is that with microdata, you still want to have something systematic on this. So you want to have, even if you have companies, you're not as much interested in the exact company, you're interested in where the economic activity is, what the size of the company is, certain kinds of characteristics you want to classify. So I think what we can focus on, and we will do this week, is how can we classify those companies if we get that information. Company information as such doesn't help that much. If you have it systematically available, you can compare this across countries and hopefully also link it up with like registers or enterprise group registers, so you see the network availability. Thank you.
Our colleague from INSEE wants the mic. Can it come forward? In the front row. Thank you.
Thank you. More a remark than a question, and maybe some hints about your last question. Because I think that the main challenge is microdata. But to be understandable, we need pre-made boxes in the head of people who hear us or who look at our statistics. And the problem is that for the moment there are not boxes or either wrong boxes. And I would like to insist on one point. People confused very oftenly value chain and activity chain, production chain. Production can occur in one place, but value added we don't know at the end. And we can see income, maybe it's a step ahead. And the question is the transfer between. And so we need boxes. I think that the transfer concept is omitted, and we need it. We need also to show that there are global value added and available value added on one territory. We need some different words and boxes to help people understand. And last, I think that it is because enterprises are viewed largely by decider and specialized people even as production object. And transfers is state. But with multinational enterprises, they do the whole process and the different operation: production, distribution, transfer, financing, etc. And so the question is, we can go only step by step with statistics, but we have, on the other side, to prepare some boxes to help people understand what pieces of the puzzle we have and what we have not. And the question of transfer and capacity of transfer is very important to understand what happened and to understand the link between backward view and forward view. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just a very short final remark from my side. I think I do recognize again all those questions that you asked, because they're questions that we're asking all the time. Okay, so who are actually the beneficial owners of, you know, when you look at certain value chains? Because when you ask the question about politics, then oftentimes those are the key issues: is where does the money flow, who owns what, where is the control? I think the message that I maybe want to leave you at is that with the challenges that we're facing, the statistics community, in my view, in the policy world, is increasingly at in the eye of the storm, really, if you want so. And this creates huge pressure for this community. But I also think that this is something, and that's the case that we try to make with policymakers. If we're debating these kind of questions with policymakers, it also means more resources need to be made available. There needs to be greater support and engagement with this, because otherwise we just won't get there. And if it's Arnold with a couple of PhD students that is trying to figure this out, then that's maybe not enough. And so I think that is the kind of the observation that I want to leave you with.
All right, I'm conscious that we would like also to give sufficient room for the next two speakers, so I would like to suggest to break for coffee for about 10 minutes. Jaakko, thank you very much. Arnold, thank you very much. You both have raised an important sort of context in which we saw that academia and the political economy, so to speak, have high expectations. We have to manage those expectations, and I think we have to talk about that management of expectations, and we will take some further steps in after the break on where we could go in meeting these expectations. I suggest that we reconvene at 11:35. That means 10 minutes break. Is that sufficient for you all, or I leave it at that, 10 minutes? No, steve, it's fine. We have 11:20, so 11:30. Thank you very much.